that says, oh, well, you're going way fast here because what's the worst possible thing you can try to get your quadrotor to fly? Fly through a 90-degree corner at high speed. And if I plot that, it's going to be all good to fly this, all good to fly that, all the infeasibility happens at this one point. So there is some interesting ideas there, and that was actually, we were thinking of doing a paper in that direction, but it's non-trivial. So doing it the easy way doesn't really work that well.
Okay.
So,
did you do any look at multiple cameras?
Great question. So one of the big questions we had doing the drone cinematographer was, well, if you have these static shots, well, why don't we fly a swarm of drones and kind of fly them all together so that each one of them is capturing a different shot. And then when I say, okay, I want to cut from like looking at you to looking at somebody else, I don't have to move the quadrotor. I already have another one ready there. I would actually think that's awesome follow-up work to this. Like swarm planning in drones is a pretty rich field in general. And obviously one of the biggest questions of safety gets a lot more complicated, because now you're busy planning paths that multiple quadrotors have to fly around, not intersect each other. And there's interesting questions about, well, but 2 quadrotors or 3 quadrotors, well, I can't put a quadrotor at every possible shot, so which ones do I pick? But yeah, I actually think that would be pretty cool.
I had a slightly different multi-camera question, which is, have you thought about 3D capture? And does it make the math totally insane, or does it actually kind of fall out from what you got?
You mean 3D capture, like capturing 3D movies?
Yeah. So maintaining the right kind of angle as you zoom in and out, et cetera.
Here's kind of a, I've not thought about that much actually, but here's an interesting thing that might happen. We're used to seeing two kinds, like our brains are used to seeing our eyes being this wide apart. And if I move my eyes much further apart, like having 2 cameras far apart, then everything seems much smaller to me.
Yeah.
So I can kind of build Godzilla cam by having like 2 quads that's meters apart, and if I'm looking at that through VR, the world would look really tiny to me, which could be kind of an interesting effect.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of the safety concern where you have to back up. And I think when you back up, you probably have to get the eyes farther apart to avoid it looking weird.
That's a good point. Yeah. If you're kind of specifically curious about this drone cinematographer, this kind of tap-to-fly interface, we kind of very specifically engineered this trajectory planning system. That's the main system that breaks our trajectory planning system, because this was very carefully engineered to have 1 quad, 1 or 2 people. That's how we kind of got all of this high-speed, real-time trajectory planning out. So that'll break, but that's an opportunity. I would say that's pretty interesting. Probably a different way of doing it would be to actually have multiple cameras on the same quadrotor. And one of the things that kind of needs to be, you have 2 gimbals, and you can do the correct discrepancy and the correct way that your eyes move as well on a drone.
So do you take into account weather, or is that just like not, you don't like fly if like the weather is like horrible?
That's a great question. So in the iPad app that I showed you, they do weather alerts. So they'll tell you you can't fly today, or you shouldn't fly today. You can't stop you. You shouldn't fly today because the wind is more than 20 miles an hour, or it's raining, or the like. Or in fact, there's a type of weather that we don't often think about, which is what our GPS constellation looks like. So we don't always have the same amount of GPS satellites. So whenever we go out and fly, Jane, she's like we always check what the constellation looks like first. Here's an interesting idea actually that we were playing around with. Often with things like this, like with GPS constellations, I want to avoid flying through certain areas. I want to avoid flying, say, avoid flying through GPS shadows. So if all of my GPS satellites are sitting on that side of the building, then flying against the wall on this side means my GPS coverage is going to be bad. And having something like that inside a tool like this to give you visual feedback about it, that would be interesting. or even to use some ideas from the robotics community to say, well, can we automatically pan tasks that take this into account? That would be pretty interesting. All of the work I've seen on that uses this technique called POMDPs, which is pretty heavyweight, which takes a long time to find trajectories. So they aren't great for building real-time tools like this, at least nothing I've seen. But yeah, that would be pretty interesting. The other dirty secret is these quadrotors are actually pretty good even in heavy winds. So you can mostly just ignore things like drag and wind resistance until you start building that 20G quad, and then all that goes up.
From one inmate to another, that was the most beautiful escape plan presentation I've ever seen.
Oh, that's all.
Anyway, I do have a real question.
Thanks, Ben.
The preview, you mentioned all the preview shots you had. You mentioned they came from a Google data set.
Yes.
How do those of us who are still inmates get access to that? What are your suggestions for using it? What's it called?
Oh man, yeah, I have bad news for you there. Technically, as of last December, that API is deprecated. They used an old Netscape 2 API that we were mining. It's still running, and so one of the things that Amber did was, what their API lets you do is place a camera in a virtual environment and then like extract a JPEG image. So if you want to mine data out of Google, what you can do is move a camera around and take a bunch of pictures and then run some structure from motion or multi-view stereo pipeline and reconstruct that geometry hundreds of times. Doesn't work that well, but it is possible to kind of mine the actual geometry out of Google. The other direction to go is Apple. Apple Maps currently has an API that you can get all of their. You can't get the geometry, but you can kind of like render yourself virtual previews using their data. Probably more interesting is to figure out ways that you can acquire that data effectively yourself.
Amazing presentation. I just want to know, how can you adapt this work and make it work in like indoor unsupervised environments?
When you say unsupervised?
So like you don't have a map like Google Earth for like for the gate building.
Sure. I'll split that into trying to answer two separate questions. One is, how do we do it indoors? Okay. So nothing that we did is specific to indoors except for the fact that we're using GPS. Right. So the real question there is, how do we do indoor localization? Nobody's really won that war yet. There's a ton of different ways of doing it. The ultra-wideband stuff I mentioned is looking pretty promising. That works by having little motes. You're basically building your own satellites. You're throwing little motes in the environment and you can localize yourself with that. There's a ton of interesting work on computer vision and LiDAR-based systems. They all work by, answering the second part of your question, building a map as you move around and then localizing yourself in this map using SLAM-based techniques. I think the problem of, I don't have a map, I don't know what my 3D environment looks like, I want to go and plan cool cinematography, that's a very different question. And I can't really draw on computer graphics primitives anymore, because cinematographers tend to not work like that. Even documentary filmmakers will go and scout the place first and like figure out what looks good, where should I place my camera. So at this point, yeah, I don't know how we would do that. But that would be pretty interesting to say, like, fly a quadrotor into a disaster zone and get me news coverage and make sure it looks good. We can obviously follow some of the visual composition principles. Like I can say, fly a quadrotor around and do face detection, and when you see a face, apply the rules there. Something simple like that.
Okay, let's just take one or two more questions.
Sure.
So when you have a trajectory that satisfies cinematic concerns, do you usually look into inversing that and generating a series of other trajectories that also satisfy the cinematic concerns, or might be more feasible for them to optimal environment? I like this shot, gives me like the set of shots that would also work physically.
We didn't do that, but the biggest reason we didn't do that is that we use a specific formulation of trajectories where we use polynomial splines, which is very easy to generate and easy to check, but they're harder to do things like, well, let me figure out how to change this and fix feasibility. That's actually one of the things that Mike worked on. So I'll answer that with a different suggestion. What if we crowdsource that idea? And so say, okay, I have this neat tool, it's built in the web browser, it runs online. Every person that comes to Stanford that sets up, that says, oh, I want a cool shot around the tower, if they create that, we have it in this online database, and we can say, well, here's 20 different shots that people have created. And maybe Stanford wants to create really nice shots of its campus, so they'll get Steven Spielberg to come set up some really epic shots. And when you're over here, you say, oh, like, I want to film the tower. Oh, well, my shot looks pretty crappy, but luckily for me, there's a shot set up by a famous cinematographer just around the corner. And in fact, one of the ideas that we might use to combine these tools is to say, well, I want a nice shot of myself kind of framed in front of Hoover Tower that then follows some pre-made trajectory. And so we can combine some of these ideas to say, well, I'll start off by finding good shots of people using the drone cinematographer, and I'll link those trajectories into something that Forrest can generate.
Okay, one more question, or no more questions?
Yeah. I just have a question. Can you use sensors for safety, like in real time, as opposed to?
Ha-ha! I have backup slides for that. Oh, wait a second, I'm gonna. So if you use Keynote on the new MacBook Pros, they show you the slides on the phone. Ha-ha! Works. So an interesting question is, yeah, many quadrotors these days, they're kind of the latest and greatest, they come out with what's called reactive obstacle avoidance. So they have things like sonar sensors on them, or LiDAR, or some kind of sensor that tries to detect when an obstacle comes close by. So what happens if we try to use that for cinematography? Well, I'll just give you an example. Here's a simple shot, a person's just flying his quadrotor straight down this pathway. So everything seems fine, but once it detects this tree, it'll kind of abruptly stop. And in general, this is a little bit of a contrived example, I admit, but in general, the problem with any of these reactive obstacle avoidance systems is that you'll get this feeling of like, well, I'm doing something and I'm going to hit this invisible wall and I'm going to go and do something else. So you really want to proactively plan your path to avoid obstacles rather than just kind of reactively hit them. Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay.
I swear it wasn't.
All right, I'm going to ask everybody to